But Robin, can I just go back to this question that you raised about South Africa and Smuts? And of course, we can go back to World War One and the League of Nations. And Smuts, of course, was instrumental in the idea of self-determination as a racist sort of principle of a hierarchy and all this. But my question is, so the way you're educating our audience and our listeners with this idea that there's a South African colonized tradition and history of resistance and of interpretation of justice versus the colonizers' racist, sort of separate but equal kind of notion, if not genocidal notion. There's a tension within the colonizers. But a lot of our listeners, and me in particular, and my brothers, we're always confused because when you go back to the historical record, you mentioned Du Bois, there is this question and we're always shocked, and it's always the most dispiriting part is when you go back and you read about Du Bois and you read about how Zionist Du Bois was in 48, and it's in 46, 47, 48. It's so distressing to us to read about Du Bois, and it's often used by Zionists to say, you see, look, the brilliant Black liberation thinker was himself a Zionist. Therefore, Zionist is a national liberation movement, or Zionism is. Do you see what I'm saying? They always use Du Bois, and then they point to MLK, of course, and they point to all these other phenomenal historical great Black figures who supported Zionism. So how do you explain that to our listeners to tell us a little bit? I mean, how does that compare with the third world, South Africa, and then the shift that takes place later on? I mean, is there a way of explaining this to our listeners and audience? Because it's something that is always brought up.
Yes, yes, yes. No, there's a way, and be patient with me, because it's a complicated story. I mean, on the one hand, you have Du Bois, but you also have Paul Robeson, who was a very strong Zionist. In fact, A. Philip Randolph, by the way, Bayard Rustin, who's now a big hero, he died of Zionists. I mean, he was a stone cold Zionist. We could talk about him. But to go back to that moment, I mean, you got to imagine, first of all, before 1948, there's different varieties of Zionism. There is like the left labor Zionism, however it manifested itself later. This was this idea that among socialists and communists, that Zionism was the communist nationalism. It was, they imagined a socialist state someplace in the world without actually considering the consequences of dispossession, right? So all that sort of all pre-1948. Paul Robeson himself, like Du Bois, they were involved with the American Jewish Anti-Fascism Committee. Robeson sang songs in Yiddish. They linked Jewish freedom to the creation of Israel. Du Bois himself certainly did this. There was a moment in which, so you have Jewish Zionism, and with that comes these Black intellectuals who identify with Jewish Zionism as a kind of secular identification with a nationalist movement, which is seen as a movement for freedom. Okay, this is all before 48, and then you have those Black nationalists who mirrored Zionism, like Marcus Garvey. They saw how Jewish Zionism resonated with the reading of Exodus in the Bible. And Garvey himself actually was toying with the idea of adopting Judaism as the religion of the Garvey movement, of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Why? Not only because a lot of his donors were Jamaican Jews, by the way, that's a true story, but also because he had brought into his circle figures like Rabbi Arnold J. Ford, who was a Black Jew who ended up going to Ethiopia. And so they saw Judaism and Zionism as the religion and ideology of an oppressed nation trying to create self-determination. So that all exists, right, at the same time. Now, why is it that someone like Du Bois, especially given the fact that Du Bois had become a Marxist, By 1948, he was identifying with the left clearly. Du Bois and Robeson were as close to the Communist Party as you can get. Why? Well, the Communist Party's position was support Zionism. I mean, overall. And then something happens in 1956. I know a lot of times we think about 67 as a turning point, but what I'm finding is that 56 is a turning point because of, Israel's participation with Britain and France in the attack on Egypt after Egypt is, nationalized the Suez Canal. Why is this important? Well, one of the most important massacres, of course, takes place in Gaza. That is the massacre by Israelis of Palestinians in refugee camps in Khan Yunis, in Rafah. I mean, all places that we're talking about today in 1956. And this is when Du Bois actually pulls back from Zionism. He basically is much more critical of Israel for the first time. And he ends up, I wouldn't say that he ends up being anti-Zionist, but he definitely ends up being a sharp critic of Israel. Almost a lot of Black leftists in the Communist Party began to split over this question of 1956. Again, this is a decade before 67. And I think
Robin, that's because of Africa. In other words, Egypt as Africa, as opposed to Palestine, as opposed to Palestinians, as opposed to solidarity with Palestinians. Is that, am I understand?
It's both of those things, meaning that, and I could mention Malcolm X and Dr. King in a second about this, but it was primarily the violation of Egyptian sovereignty, number one, the identification with Egypt as a heroic nation, both for Africa and for the Third World. But it's the reports of the massacre in Khan Yunis, Rafah, and I think it was one other, in Gaza that actually concerned a lot of people who are, so in other words, we may not call it solidarity with Palestine generally, but certainly a critique of Israeli massacres of Palestinians. And that's where there are two moments that I'm trying to deal with right now in thinking about that 56. And if you indulge me, both involve the issue involves both Dr. King and Malcolm X. So Malcolm X, we know, ends up visiting, goes to Egypt. He ends up visiting Gaza. And in 1964, he writes this article called Zionist Logic, where he calls Israel a kind of a new form of colonialism. He excoriates Israel in Zionism. And he points to, and what moved him was that visit to see and talk to people who were victims of the massacre in Khan Yunis and Rafah, right? And again, this is, 8 years earlier, but they have memories of this moment. The other thing is Dr. King. And again, I've written about Dr. King kind of post-67 or that moment of 67, but I begin to really think about 1959. So Dr. King actually goes to Jerusalem, Nablus, Hebron, Nazareth, again, through Jordan to visit the holy site. This is 1959. He goes with his wife, Coretta Scott King. And he comes back and he gives a sermon in 1959, which calls Walk Through the Holy Land. And in that sermon, he tells the story of Jesus, like bearing his cross. And part of it's about why did Jesus become a revolutionary? Because he describes Jesus essentially as a revolutionary, pays this huge price. And he's a revolutionary against occupation, against the Roman occupation. He's, so he's carrying his cross and he's about to be executed. He's been detained, everything. And he's carrying his cross and he stumbles. And according to King, a Black man named, Simon of Cyrene, though he's not Black, he's Libyan, right? But King calls him a black man, helps him carry that cross. Now, what King did was he changed the sermon, he changed the parable basically to fit his argument, which is that he sort of presents Simon's act of bearing the cross as an act of solidarity with Jesus, when in fact, what Simon was doing was doing what the Romans told him to do. You know, he basically wasn't defying Roman law at all, but actually abiding by the law, because his job was to help Jesus get there so he could die. And he was being obedient, right? But King presented him as being obedient to the what he calls the unenforceable. And so in that sermon, King knows about the massacre in Khan Yunis. He knows about the massacre in Rafah. He knows about it. He's heard about it. It's in the Black press, by the way. And that's where he does this funny thing where he presents Simon as representative of the Third World insurrection. And in the sermon, he praises the United Nations as like the resurrection of the crucified League of Nations, right? He says, and I have to quote this because it says, before there can ever be peace in this world, we must turn to an instrument like the United Nations to disarm the whole world and develop a world police power so that no nation will possess atomic and hydrogen bombs for destruction. And he goes on to say the UN is that force. And he believes in the UN. And it's no accident that just 3 years earlier, it was the director of UNRWA who, you know, in the Middle East, who submits this damning report to the General Assembly about the massacres in Khan Yunis and Rafah. And so imagine King identifying with the UN as a potential arbiter of a higher law, right? Consistent with this kind of unenforceable moral and ethical order, and that the UN would emerge as the principal villain in the Zionist narrative, right? So I think that both King early on and Malcolm early on and Du Bois early on and a whole range of Black liberal / leftists are moved by the massacre to rethink Israel's role. It's not a 100% turnaround or 180-degree turnaround, but it is a consideration that sets the stage later, certainly for Malcolm X's statement, but for King's statement later. And I think for Du Bois's, what becomes, again, his critical stance toward Israel from 1956 until he dies in 1963. Again, he doesn't disavow Zionism. I think he sees Israeli state power as separate from the kind of vision of Zionism, which is still rooted in the kind of left Zionism that people believed in, which is just a dream. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It makes a lot of sense. But is that I mean, that's a very generous. I mean, it's a crucial reading that you're providing, Robin. But what about? I mean, so maybe shifting a little bit in terms of saying, but how do you account for the fact that somebody else could look at the same set of documents and say exactly as you're saying that MLK, Dr. King continued until, I mean, there's a shift about the Vietnam War. There's a relationship, obviously, between racism in America, anti-Black racism, poverty, war, imperialism. There's obviously a development in Dr. King in the 60s, right? But what about the people who keep saying, but look, he was a Zionist until very late? So how do you, like, are we over generous in our reading of this 59 sermon as a way of, how do we relate that to the fact that there's a documented tradition text?
So let me just further clarify. I don't think King ever disavowed Zionism. See, what I'm suggesting is that that he and others were trying to make a separation between Israeli policies and Zionism. So in other words, King, I would argue that King was a Zionist, continued to be. But what I'm trying to figure out, for example, is that it's like they wanted, they had a dream of what Zionism is supposed to be, and they wanted Israel to conform to that. They did not make the leap, which I think is an important leap to make, is that it's Zionism's fundamentally an expression of state power. And that's the leap that he wasn't willing to make. Now, why is that? Why did King have trouble? I think there's a couple things going on. And I don't think it's simply a matter of the fact that he had a lot of donors who, because once he had any criticism of Vietnam War, he lost a lot of support. That's the Vietnam War. King, was very he was an Old Testament and New Testament, person. He was a religious figure who did really believe in historic Palestine as the land of the Jews. They all agreed with that. But he wasn't interested in dispossession. Now, the thing with King is that, again, I'm not defending him at all, but I think that part of his interpretation of what Zionism comes from his reading of Martin Buber. That he and Buber actually had a correspondence. They were very tight. Buber actually was writing on behalf of King to the federal government, to the president, to Lyndon Johnson and to Kennedy at some point. And so why Buber? Well, Buber's interesting in that he was an advocate. He was a hardcore Zionist, but an advocate of a binational state. That was his position. He was involved in the not just the defense of Palestinians, but he was actually working toward trying to ensure the right to return. And for that reason, he became a pariah in Israel. He never left Israel, nor did he ever disavow Zionism. He's like, my Zionism is about trying to create a religious, ethical position that the Jews would accept their global responsibility as an ethical people. And so therefore, because Buber's position was there should be no dispossession. There should be no removal of the Palestinian Arab, so-called Arab population, right? And that we're going to live in peace and harmony. And so when you look at Buber, my question, of course, is how much of Buber's writings was King familiar with? King quoted Buber all the time. But he was never willing to say, King was never willing to say, well, my Zionism is this one. Instead, he was silent. He just simply said in a very generic way that I'm a Zionist, I support Zionists, and I support Israel's right to exist, as if that's a question, right? Now there's that story, but there's another story about King, which I think is worth considering, is that 67, 67, he was actually planning to go on this pilgrimage. 5,000, something like 5,000 Black people, some ridiculous number, were going to go on this pilgrimage to the Holy Land and visit Israel. And King was about to go, and then it was planned. It was announced in March. Actually, it was announced like 6 months before. The war takes place, in June, and then of course the trip is canceled. And behind the scenes, King is like, well, we can't go now because if we go, it's going to look like we're endorsing Israel's position. He says this. He doesn't say it out loud, but he says it in private correspondence and conversations. He says, and it looks like Israel's not going to give up Jerusalem. That's what he says. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that he's anti-Zionist? No. It means that he is still holding on to an idea of Zionism as an expression of justice exuding from the Holy Land. And I think the thing we have to investigate is how did they understand Zionism? What did they see it? How did they see its function? And that's where 67 becomes really important because, as you know, that's the year when the war itself opened up the doors for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, for the Black Panther Party, for Revolutionary Action Movement, for all these movements to say explicitly what Malcolm X said in 1964, and that is that Zionism is colonialism, straight up.